Webinars on mineral resources in Arctic. We have stopped to do these webinars in June after Carrie's talk, and now we start again. So first, I would like to apologize for last month. Due to technical issues, I was not able to run the webinars. However, webinars with Thor Thordarson from Iceland University on applied volcanology as mineral exploration tools will be postponed on 7th of December. So you could see him there. Today, the webinar is given by Sarah Dare, who is professor and holder of the Canadian Research Chair on geochemistry applied to ore deposit at University of Quebec in Chicoutimi in Canada. She is going to talk about her work on distribution of PGEs among the mineral at Sudbury. So as a reminder, do not forget that if you have questions for Sarah, please type them in the chat on the right bottom tabs, and we will answer that at the end of the session. So Sarah, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's good morning here in Canada for me. So today I'd like to give you kind of an overview of applications of how we can use laser ablation ICP-MS to determine in situ the PGEs in base metal sulfides from Ni-Cu-PGE deposits, and how we can apply that to try and understand the processes that control the distribution of PGE in these kind of deposits. So I've put some pictures at the bottom here. You see the one in the middle there, your base metal sulfides, chalcopyrite, pyrite, pentlandite. I'll use the arrow. These little spots here are actually the laser pits. So that's what we do is to determine the trace elements in situ at the mineral scale. However, I'm not just going to be talking about laser ablation results today. We combine it actually with a detailed study of the platinum group minerals. That's the other main host of PGE in these deposits. So these are discrete little minerals where the PGE are major constituents of the mineral. And we combine that with the whole rock to kind of understand how much of the PGE are hosted in base metal sulfides and how much in these PGM. Next slide. Before I start, I'd just like to say that this work was done during my postdoc with Professor Sarah Jane Barnes here at University of Quebec at Chicoutimi with her Canada Research Chair. So it was part of a much larger program of many, many students to study PGEs and other chalcophyll elements in base metal sulfides from many different PGE type deposits. The work for the platinum group mineral study was in collaboration with the late Professor Hazel Richard at Cardiff University using the scanning electron microscope, the Pete Fisher. And as I was studying Sudbury, I was collaborating with Dr. Peter Lightfoot and the Valley team who made this project possible. So for those who are not necessarily familiar with magmatic ore deposits and platinum group minerals, what are the PGE? They're precious metals. They're here in the periodic table. There we go, the little arrow. They consist of a group of 6 elements. So it's osmium, iridium, ruthenium, rhodium, palladium, and platinum. They're typically associated with gold as well. You can see I've highlighted in yellow here, they're all the chalcophyll elements. So of course you've got your base metals, nickel, copper, that form these nickel deposits. I'd just also like to mention the semi-metals such as arsenic, tellurium, bismuth, and tin, as I will be speaking about their importance later in controlling where the PGE go within the sulfide system. So why are we interested in platinum group elements? Just look at their prices today. They're precious metals, as I said. The price of gold is currently around $1,200 per ounce. Platinum is just a little bit less, $800. Palladium around $1,000, and rhodium $2,300. So they are very, they are very expensive. So even if you have just a small amount, a couple of ppm in your deposit, it's definitely worth mining that to get as a byproduct some extra money. The base metals, nickel and copper, for comparison, they're a lot more abundant, of course. So their price per pound in US dollars is around $6 and $3. So these are economic resources. So I'm talking today about Ni-Cu-PGE sulfide deposits. Of course, you can get PGEs mainly are mined from PGE-rich deposits that are sulfide poor, such as in the bushveld, layered intrusion. You have little thin horizons that are very rich in PGE. Here I'm talking about a system where you have a lot of sulfide with PGEs as a byproduct. So essentially, where do you find Ni-Cu-PGE sulfide deposits? You need a mafic, ultramafic magma that was rich in nickel. You form an immiscible sulfide liquid, essentially by saturating the magma in sulfur. For nickel deposits, nickel sulfide deposits, you need an external source of sulfur, such as host rock containing sedimentary sulfur. That will trigger the formation of sulfide liquid through immiscibility, and as soon as you form a sulfide liquid, it will collect all the chalcophile metals according to the partition coefficient. So PGEs are very highly compatible into sulfide liquid, so they will be extremely enriched in the sulfide liquid as well as nickel copper. So here, I won't go into the details of how they form, the geological setting. This figure is taken from Barnes and Lightfoot 2005, which is a great review. If you want to read up on how they form, where you find them, I suggest you go read this article, this review article. So here is a schematic that essentially need your mafic host intrusion, the massive sulfides you find typically at the base. Essentially, a sulfide liquid is very dense, so it will trickle down towards the base. If you have fractures in the footwall, the sulfide liquid will very easily drain into that. So often you find them outside of the intrusion in the footwall. Typically, the massive sulfide is then overlaid by matrix ore, so that's kind of interstitial net textured sulfides. And then sometimes we have this globular ore where we have large droplets of sulfide. So you can see in this schematic that commonly the sulfides will fractionate. You will have a copper-rich top and an iron-rich base, both in the globular ore and also in the massive ore. And this iron-copper zoning is now well studied, essentially is caused by fractional crystallization of the sulfide liquid. Very much like we have in a silicate magma, where we start off with the mafic, ultramafic cumulates, and we finish off with something more felsic. We have exactly the same thing happening in the sulfide system. Excuse me. So here is just to show you on a thin section scale. This is globular ore from Norilsk, which is a subvolcanic intrusion hosting these big droplets of sulfides. In Russia, this was a study by my former supervisor who started off this whole interest in lasering sulfides, in fact. So here we can see at the top of the globule is the copper-rich, which here is cubanite. Typically, it's chalcopyrite as well. They're the copper minerals. The iron base essentially comprises pyrite and pentlandite, which is the nickel iron sulfide. So here's your pyrite, here's the pentlandite, and these were the very first laser analyses of sulfides from this deposit. So this is showing again that this is caused by fractional crystallization to cause this zoning. Now in massive ore bodies, such as at Sudbury, also at Voisey's Bay, essentially you will get large ore bodies or zones of iron-rich ore on the left and your copper-rich ore on the right. So we know from just analyzing this as a bulk analysis that the chemistry varies according to whether you're iron-rich or copper-rich. So iron-rich is typically fairly enriched in nickel. For this sample, it's nearly 5% nickel, around 2% copper, but very low platinum palladium, only 2 ppm. You can see it's made of pyrite with these little pentlandite veins. Occasionally you get little pockets of chalcopyrite. That is essentially like, you can think of it as trapped liquid within iron sulfide cumulate rock. For the copper-rich ore, it's essentially mainly comprised of either chalcopyrite plus or minus cubanite. They're the copper minerals. Pentlandite is commonly there as well. And in fact, the black I've marked on here is magnetite, an iron oxide. It's common as well in massive sulfides. So the copper-rich ore still contains nickel, about 1%. As it's nearly pure chalcopyrite, it contains 30% copper. And with it, of importance, is that the platinum palladium is now very enriched compared to the iron-rich ore, around 40 ppm for this sample. So this is now telling us how the platinum group elements behave during sulfide fractionation, that there is a difference between these two ore zones. And so if we look at now a whole rock assay from Sudbury, for example, we plot it against the classic diagram of your nickel, your platinum group elements, finished by copper, normalized to primitive mantle. You can see that here the iron-rich ores are this white field, and the copper-rich ores are the actual lines of data here. There we go. So you can see that as you go from iron-rich ore to copper-rich ore, the PGEs fractionate. They change during sulfide liquid fractionation. So you have an increase in your platinum, palladium, gold, and a decrease in your osmium, iridium, ruthenium, rhodium group, which I will use the term IPGE, iridium group, platinum PGE, to save time of saying osmium, iridium, ruthenium, rhodium. They're the IPGE. So you can see that the IPGEs decrease during fractionation and the platinum palladium increase in the copper-rich ores. So we know that's well established. We know that just from doing whole rock. So numerous studies based on experiments, whole rock, now starting off with the laser ablation studies, we all agree on a magmatic model that explains this fractionation of the PGE in sulfide system due to fractionation of the sulfide liquid. So I will explain this model. Essentially, first off, from your sulfide liquid, which contains all the chalcophile elements, the first mineral to crystallize at around 1,000 degrees is an iron-rich sulfide. The experiments, we only really see this high-temperature sulfide preserved in experiments where they're quenched, and also in mid-ocean ridge basalt, sulfide droplets, where also they are quenched. And in fact, Clifford Patton studied that with Sarah Jane, and Cliff is here listening today. Otherwise, most of the sulfides we see today are lower temperature exsolution products of these higher temperature phase sulfides. So the first sulfide, we call it MSS, monosulfide solid solution. I will try to not use that acronym as it can be confusing. I will try to call this as an iron-rich sulfide. So this is first to crystallize at high temperature. We know that it's rich in nickel, the IPGE, also rhenium. That's because those elements partition into the iron-rich sulfides. All the other chalcophile elements do not. They are highly incompatible into this iron-rich sulfide. Therefore, the remaining elements like copper, platinum, palladium, gold, bismuth, tellurium, most of the other chalcophile elements will partition or be enriched in the residual liquid, the copper-rich liquid. So we think of the iron-rich sulfide ore as an early accumulate phase. Then essentially this residual liquid rich in copper, platinum, palladium will then crystallize a copper-rich sulfide, a high-temperature sulfide termed ISS, intermediate solid solution. Again, I will try to keep this terminology out. I'll call it copper-rich sulfide, which essentially means it's crystallized from the residual liquid enriched in copper, platinum, palladium. And now we believe that there's also a late-stage volume melt, small volume melt, which will actually be super enriched in platinum, palladium, and most of the other metals. And I will try to convince you why. It's because these elements do not partition into the copper-rich sulfide, therefore they get enriched in the tiny, small volume melts that exist. So I mentioned the copper-rich ISS and the iron-rich MSS. We don't see them today. The actual ore comprises a number of base metal sulfides, and they form just under 600 degrees, exsolving out of these higher temperature precursors. So the iron-rich ore, that's why, now comprises pyrite, pentlandite, which is the nickel's iron sulfide. Chalcopyrite will be there if you have trapped liquid, the trapped copper-rich liquid. In the copper-rich ore, which crystallizes from the residual liquid enriched in platinum, palladium, you have the copper minerals, so chalcopyrite, cubanite, and pentlandite. So now I get to why do we care where the PGE are? We know from the whole rock that if you want platinum, palladium, you go look at the copper-rich ores. However, when you come to trying to extract the PGE, you want to know which mineral is it in. Do you target the little discrete platinum group minerals, such as this picture here? It's only 60 microns across. However, this is a spherulite, platinum arsenide, which contains about 50% platinum, even though it's very small volume. Or do you target the base metals that might contain a few tens or 100 ppm of palladium, such as in pentlandite? So in order to do that, you want to analyze in situ the trace elements and the PGE in the different minerals, specifically the base metal sulfides listed here. So this is important, as I mentioned, to help improve the extraction, which mineral do you target, but also this can really help us understand the petrogenesis of these PGE deposits, the origin and timing of when each of these minerals formed, which is what the rest of this talk will be about. So how do we actually kind of quantify which mineral hosts the PGE? For that, I'll be showing you most of the time this kind of graph, which is you've got your PGEs and gold along the bottom, and it's the height of the bar. This is essentially 100% of the element hosted in base metal sulfide. So this combines, I'll explain in the next slide how you get here, combines your laser data with your whole rock to essentially show you that for this example at Norilsk, that say here you see 100% of rhenium, nearly 100% of rhodium are hosted in the different sulfide phases. So black is pentlandite, grey is pyrite, the diagonal bar is chalcopyrite. So you can see that in fact most of the PGE are hosted in the sulfides, apart from platinum and gold, which will be hosted predominantly by the PGM. So here's the actual details of how we do this mass balance. Essentially, so you need the concentration of your PGE in the sulfide mineral. That's where we use the laser data. You need to multiply that by the weight fraction of your base metal sulfide. So I've given you the data here. So 65% pyrite, 21% pentlandite, and you divide that by how much of your PGE is in the whole rock. So for this example, the whole rock contains only 0.35 ppm palladium. This is your iron-rich ore. This is the average laser data for palladium from pentlandite. It's around only 1 ppm, chalcopyrite 0.6, pyrite very, very little. So depending on how much of each of these phases in the whole rock, you can see that even though the whole rock only comprises 21% pentlandite, as it's the most rich in palladium, it actually contributes more or less 50% of palladium in the whole rock assay. So if your addition of your sulfide mass balance does not equal 100, the missing amount we can assume essentially is hosted by the platinum group minerals. So this way we're able to say whether the sulfides contain the PGEs or the platinum group minerals or combination of the both. So that's how we can quantitatively understand the distribution of the PGE among these different minerals. So the laser ablation, how do we determine the PGE in the sulfides? During my postdoc, I was here at University of Quebec à Chicoutimi in the lab that really was one of the first to do in situ PGE analyses in sulfides. On the left here, you can see the laser track. So it's a destructive technique, essentially almost drilling across or into the sulfide surface. The material is ablated and then carried by a gas into the ICP-MS where it's determined, that its concentration is determined. On the right is a typical spectra. So to do one line of about 200 microns, it takes only 80 seconds, time on the x-axis here. The y-axis, that's counts per second that you get from the ICP-MS. So the first 20 seconds, you determine what is the concentration of the trace elements of interest in the gas blank. Turn the laser on. This is the signal going across or into the sulfide. And it's really useful because you will instantly see when you hit an inclusion of a silicate or a platinum group mineral. For this instance, is arsenic and all the PGE here. So if you want to know what trace elements are in just the sulfide, you can exclude that platinum group mineral inclusion so that you can accurately determine how much PGE in the sulfide. You can also use this time-resolved analysis to see if there's any zonation. So we typically use a beam size of 50 to 80 microns. The larger the beam size, the better the detection limits. Here I give you an idea of the detection limits. This was using the old machine, the old instrument. With the new instruments, the detection limits are even better. So we're talking about several ppb, which is what you need to determine trace elements in sulfides really. Here in this box on the left, if you're interested, details of the calibration. Again, Ni-Cu-PGE is one of the specialized labs because you need sulfide reference materials containing the elements you want to analyze, complications with interferences. And Ni-Cu-PGE now has developed a new sulfide standard, so if anyone is ever interested in obtaining this, you can just contact me and I'll put you in touch with Danny Savard, who runs the lab. So I mentioned that laser ablation, if you do lines across, you can then see if there's any zonation. And this is one really neat example of a zoned pyrite from Sudbury, where by electron microprobe mapping, you can see it's definitely zoned in cobalt, it's silitree. You can see the cobalt pore core here. This is the same line. You see it's depleted in the core and enriched in the rim. Same for selenium, which you wouldn't be able to see by electron microprobe. Then if you look at the PGEs that were collected in the same line, you can see the core is really rich in rhodium, arsenic, and selenium. And now we're able to do maps using a 10 micron beam. And you can see exactly the rhodium enrichment in the core where the cobalt is poor. So now, as I get to my results from Sudbury, I just want to try and briefly give a summary of what was the state of knowledge when I did this research. So essentially, most laser work from sulfides had studied PGE-rich ore deposits, such as the Bushvelds, the Stillwater complex. These are sulfide pore systems I mentioned. Why they started there is because it's PGE-rich. It was much easier to determine high concentrations of PGE in sulfides than in nickel-copper-PGE deposits, where the PGE concentrations are so much lower. So using this mass balance to determine the percentage of each PGE hosted among the different sulfide phases, you've seen this graph before from Norilsk. It was the same results from the layered intrusions, that most of the PGE were hosted in the sulfides. Palladium is always mainly hosted in pentlandite, and the platinum and gold are never in the sulfides. They always seem to form their own platinum group minerals or gold minerals. However, at the time, only one study had been done at Sudbury Igneous Complex as an example of nickel-copper-PGE massive sulfide deposit. And here again is the same type of mass balance. This is by Ni-Cu-PGE from Kelly Lake in Sudbury. You can see it's complete opposite. Very little, only maybe 30% of ruthenium budget is hosted by the sulfides. Otherwise, where are the PGE? They're actually hosted by platinum group minerals. So the question is, why are the PGE hosted in platinum group minerals at Sudbury in a nickel-copper-PGE deposit, whereas most of the PGE are hosted in sulfides in PGE-rich deposits? So that was kind of the reason why we started the work on Sudbury. So for those who are not so familiar with Sudbury Igneous Complex, it's the world's largest nickel-copper mining camp. You can see the round circles here, essentially each mine. There are over 90 nickel-copper-PGE deposits in this elliptical structure. It's the third producer of PGE in the world, even though PGE are a byproduct. There's just so much ore that it produces a lot of PGE. It is this elliptical shape because, in fact, it is a meteorite impact that flash melted the crust. If I go, here is a schematic from Barnes and Lightfoot 2005 to show you the meteorite flash melting the crust. This melt sheet then differentiated into essentially a base of norite, that's Palladium-PX, an oxide, apatite-rich gabbro, and then on the top is a felsic, a granophyre. This is a very atypical setting for a nickel-copper-PGE deposit, and it's the main one. The reason why we don't find many other meteorite impacts containing nickel-copper PGE deposits is that we think that essentially in the target area in the crust there were already many small nickel-copper PGE deposits, and so this essentially melted everything and made it into one mega mining camp. So the nickel-copper PGE deposits are found at the base of the complex. However, Sudbury is rather complicated because at the same time there was significant hydrothermal activity. In fact, in the center here, in this Onaping formation, there are numerous hydrothermal, sorry, there's a spelling there, mistake there, zinc, lead, copper deposits that formed sub-sea floor, a bit like the VMS settings, but this is in a meteorite impact basin. So as we know there was plenty of water going through the system. What has that done to the PGEs? Then there was soon afterwards regional green schist metamorphism and local deformation, as we can see in the shear zones. Just see what the ore looks like in the mine underground. So here is your iron-rich sulfides, essentially pyrite. These form at the base of the igneous complex in physical depressions called embayments, and everyone more or less agrees that this is magmatic iron-rich cumulates in origin. However, the copper veins, which are very platinum-palladium rich, they form sharp-walled veins in the fractured footwall that was smashed by the meteorite impact. Some people think that they are the copper-rich liquid, i.e. magmatic in origin. Others think that in fact they could be hydrothermally remobilized, the copper and the PGE. And not far from here, from these copper-rich veins in the footwall, you do actually find another kind of mineralization, which is high platinum-palladium, very low sulfide deposits surrounding these copper-rich veins, and there they most certainly are, well, most probably hydrothermal in origin, remobilized out of these veins. Just one last thing that's important. These are the two study areas that I worked on, Creighton in the south, McCready in the north. Why we took one from the north and south is because the footwall rocks are different. In the north, they are granite gneisses in grey here, and the ores are arsenic, antimony, poor. However, in the south, this white colour here is essentially metavolcanic and metasedimentary rocks, and the ores Amos and Farrow showed in 2007 are significantly more enriched in arsenic and antimony in the ores. So we know there's a difference depending on the footwall, so we wanted to investigate the role of arsenic in contributing the PGE among the ore minerals, presumably due to different contamination into the melt. So I'll start off by explaining the results of combining the laser study with the platinum group minerals study to find out where the PGEs are hosted. I'll start off with the early forming iron-rich cumulate. Just to remind you, these are enriched in the iridium, rhodium, ruthenium, osmium group elements, IPGE, and relatively depleted in platinum palladium. This talk is based off my papers, essentially, that are listed here. If you're interested in more details, I'll just try to give you highlights during this talk. So for these early forming iron-rich cumulates, I really want to try and highlight the importance of arsenic content of the sulfide melt, which is due to whether your footwall contains arsenic or not, contamination, in determining where the IPGE are hosted in the sulfides or in the platinum group minerals. So on the left, I'm comparing samples of low arsenic content from the north deposit, and on the right is the higher arsenic ores from the south. So you should now be familiar with these type of diagrams. They're the mass balance to show you how much of the PGEs are contained in the base metal sulfides, and the missing amount is essentially in the platinum group minerals. So on the left, for the low arsenic ores, we can see that the results of the mass balance are pretty similar to what is normally happening in PGE-rich deposits, in that the base metal sulfides, your pyrite, pentlandite, chalcopyrite, host most of the IPGE. And certainly we did not find any platinum group minerals containing those elements, so this is kind of the normal case. So in Sudbury, in some deposits, we have no arsenic, that the PGE are hosted in your base metal sulfides. However, in the high arsenic ore on the south, you see that osmium, ruthenium is the same as in the north, that it's contained in the base metal sulfides. But for iridium and rhodium, systematically, they are absent in all the base metal sulfides, consistently in the 17 samples. And here I will show you in the next slide that are these beautiful arsenic-rich PGM containing iridium and rhodium. So this was similar to what Ni-cu-PGE first study for Sudbury, that the PGM are the main hosts of the PGE, and her deposit was also from the south. So it really depends what kind of deposit you're in and where you're located. So in the high arsenic ore from the south, these were the beautiful platinum group minerals containing either an arsenide like sperolite, platinum arsenide, or more common were these sulfarsenides. So you have arsenic sulfur as your anions, with your iridium, rhodium as your cations. And they were beautifully zoned. You can see the zoning here, and because of that zoning, we thought they are magmatic. Experiments have shown that these type of minerals do crystallize early, around 1,000 degrees. So our model was that they were co-crystallizing with the iron-rich sulfides at around 1,000 degrees, because the arsenic mineral has a high affinity for iridium and rhodium. They depleted the co-crystallizing iron sulfide in just those elements. A few years later, this was actually confirmed by some Russian experiments, showed you only need 0.1% arsenic to form sulfarsenides rich in platinum, iridium, rhodium in iron-rich ore. So that explains why those particular elements, iridium, rhodium, were depleted in the sulfides. Now, if we look at the low arsenic iron-rich ore from the north of Sudbury, where I said there's no arsenic-rich PGM, nearly all of the IPGE are hosted in the base metal sulfides. We found something a bit unusual, that there was some pyrite, euhedral here on the left, very small, unhedral here on the right, very small amounts. Excess is really just accessory amount. And I lasered this thinking it wouldn't really show anything. However, it did show that pyrite can be an important carrier for the PGE. And in fact, it's because I did the mass balance for the other minerals, the usual minerals, and rhodium was missing. I knew there was no rhodium mineral there. So I went back and analyzed the pyrite, and lo and behold, pyrite was a dominant host for the pyrite here on the right in pink. So this is show you from the same ore deposit on the left when you don't have pyrite, that the PGE are hosted in your sulfides, apart from platinum. When you do have a small amount of pyrite, suddenly rhodium goes into the pyrite. Even though it's only 1% pyrite in the whole rock, it is the main host for pyrite, for rhodium, because it contains 100 ppm. And this was also actually shown in the Bushveld by Cabri, that pyrite can host the platinum group elements. And so you're familiar with this map for rhodium, that the euhedral pyrite contains a lot of rhodium, and it shows oscillatory zonation. Here is the map for arsenic to prove to you that where you're rhodium rich, you're arsenic rich too. And then this is the anhedral one, and the map is really nice. It shows you that in the core you actually have started off as euhedral and oscillatory zoned, and then you had a later overgrowth. So now I want to show you how we use the laser to try and understand better how and why palladium is enriched in pentlandite in the iron-rich ores. So here's your 3 different textures that are common for pentlandite. You have coarse granular pentlandite. Fairly commonly it's also at the border with chalcopyrite if you have it. Then you have these pentlandite veinlets that are very thin, essentially at the grain boundary of different pyrrhotite grains. And then you have these tiny, tiny little pentlandite flames exsolving. So experiments showed that back in the 80s that pentlandite essentially exsolves out of your iron-rich sulfide because your nickel diffuses over time to form pentlandite, typically at grain boundaries. So the coarser it is, essentially the earlier it is, it's had time to diffuse and coarsen with time. So the coarse granular one, I believe, exolved first around 600. That's when the exsolution first starts. Pentlandite veins migrated to the grain boundary, started to coarsen, but didn't have time to get any thicker, so they exolved second. And the last pentlandite to exolve out are these tiny little flames, around 300 probably, that nucleates on cracks, or is a deformation twin of pyrrhotite. So what I did was to laser each of those different textures of pentlandite. So that's what I have here on the x-axis, starting off with the early on the right. That's your coarse granular pentlandite, your intermediate veinlets, and your late pentlandite flames. On the y-axis, your palladium concentration in each of those pentlandites. So you can see that the earlier the pentlandite that formed, the richer it is in palladium. That's because it subsequently depletes your iron-rich sulfide in palladium, so that the later you form, there's just less palladium to go into it. So the implications for extraction for the company was, don't worry about your pentlandite flames, don't extract that pentlandite, they're worthless. However, the big coarse granular pentlandites are probably worth to extract for palladium. This was on the instrument before we had capability to map. So essentially I did various spots around from core to rim to show that there was some kind of zonation in the pentlandite, that the center of this coarse grain of pentlandite in gray was the richest in palladium, the rim was poorest in palladium, the veinlets were very, very poor. And then if you take a transect across from core to rim, you can see systematically the palladium decreasing from core to rim. Your other PGE just remain the same, the ruthenium osmium. So this really shows that palladium is diffusing with the nickel into pentlandite, and that the early forming pentlandite is the most enriched, because the later forming one, the palladium has just been depleted in the iron-rich liquid. However, if you now look at samples of iron-rich cumulate which have some trapped liquid, i.e. they're chalcopyrite rich, say 10 to 20% chalcopyrite, I did the same textural analysis. You can see it's the same trend. The earlier forming ones are richer than the later forming flames. However, this time, because we're in a copper-rich copper-bearing sample, that suddenly the content of palladium in pentlandite is much more enriched compared to samples where there's no chalcopyrite. So we think that additional palladium diffuses into pentlandite from the trapped liquid from the copper-rich material, and that's probably because when that cools down, chalcopyrite does not contain palladium, it just does not fit in the structure. However, palladium does fit very well into pentlandite, so therefore it goes into and upgrades that pentlandite. And here is essentially to show you the same thing. When you have chalcopyrite, it's richest nearer the chalcopyrite and then becomes depleted away from it. So implications for extractions of palladium, if you have more trapped liquid, the better the concentration of palladium in your pentlandite. So now I'll show you what happens towards the end of sulfide fractionation when you have copper-rich residual liquid, essentially. How do the PGE distribute themselves among the different minerals? So these are the copper-rich ores, very enriched in platinum, palladium, also enriched in bismuth, tellurium, tin, and in fact here I just want to show you or demonstrate that it's the bismuth tellurium that's very effective in collecting the platinum group elements as a small volume late melt rather than arsenic, as we had in the iron-rich ores. So here again is the results of the laser for the mass balance for the elements of interest: platinum, palladium, bismuth, tin, and tellurium. So in yellow and black are your sulfides, and you can see that only tin is essentially hosted in your sulfides. All of the other elements here, they're just not hosted at all by your sulfide minerals. Instead, in blue, these are the platinum group minerals. So this time I was actually able to quantitatively or semi-quantitatively determine from the sizes of the platinum group minerals and the type of platinum group minerals how much PGE they contain in the samples. So you can see the importance of PGM in hosting the PGEs in these copper-rich ores. And in fact, this agrees with experiments of Liu and Brennan in 2012 that the platinum, palladium, bismuth, and telluride are just incompatible into copper-rich sulfide. They just do not fit in the structure. Therefore, they're enriched in any residual small volume liquid. And here's just to show you a pie chart of the type of platinum group minerals from these samples, that it really is dominated by, in volume, by bismuth tellurides, bismuthides, and a small amount of tin minerals. This is the model I proposed to essentially show you that when you crystallize your copper-rich sulfide, essentially that will take some nickel, that will take all the nickel, cobalt, selenium, and tin. The other trace elements, platinum, palladium, arsenic, bismuth, tellurium, are incompatible, so they end up in this trapped liquid in yellow, from which, so here's the trapped liquid, from which a composite platinum group minerals will form, essentially as droplets, trapped droplets of late melt enriched in these trace elements. So on the left, here's an actual picture from the SEM. You can see it contains about 8 different minerals. Palladium with tin, palladium with bismuth, silver with tellurium, even some galena. So in my paper, I propose that, in fact, there's almost a zonation, an order of crystallization of these platinum group minerals from the late melt. And that was based on textural associations that commonly we would see the tin minerals, such as palladium tin here, crystallizing first, and this is backed up by experiments, show they crystallize at higher temperature. And they were overgrown by the later forming bismuth tellurides, as you can see here, and then they themselves were overgrown by the silver telluride. So the textural association, what overgrows what, combined with the actual experiments proving when they first, their melting points, was able to help this model. Then something interesting from the copper-rich ores is that these primary crystallizing composite grains of platinum group minerals here, you can see they start to actually get partially dissolved. They have this cuspate edging. They look like they've been etched out. This was probably the original grain, and then it's been dissolved out. Here we can see the platinum group mineral has been dissolved out, has been partially replaced by biotite. So essentially this corroded texture I proposed was essentially of hydrothermal fluids passing through, dissolving, partly dissolving the PGEs, minerals. So where do the PGE metals go? This is in the copper-rich footwall deposits. I think that these PGEs probably then get dispersed into the surrounding footwall, forming the high platinum group element, low sulfide deposits that I mentioned at the start. So in summary, here we go. In summary, the platinum group minerals form throughout the crystallization of sulfide liquid. Let me just get all of this up. Here we go. Start off by the iron-rich ore, which, if there's no arsenic in the melt, all the IPGE and palladium are hosted by the iron sulfide minerals, pyrite, pentlandite. However, if arsenic is present in the melt, such as on the South Range due to contamination, the arsenic is a very efficient collector to select, in particular, iridium rhodium from the melt, crystallize a zoned arsenic platinum group mineral, thus depleting the co-crystallizing iron-rich sulfides. Then for the copper-rich liquid, which is enriched in platinum palladium, because the copper-rich sulfides do not take those elements, they are super enriched into late-stage trap melt, from which a whole succession of platinum minerals, mainly with bismuth tellurium and some arsenic tin, crystallizes composite grains. And then those, because they're in the footwall veins, fluids can pass through those and then hydrothermally remobilize them into, disperse them into the footwall. Then at lower temperatures, 600, when everything is solidified, essentially you have exsolution of some platinum palladium minerals from iron-rich sulfides. I didn't actually show that. I have another slide if anyone wants to see it. Palladium diffuses into the exsolving pentlandite. Rhodium, if pyrite is present and it contains arsenic, rhodium will partition preferentially into pyrite. And then I mentioned this remobilization of PGEs by fluids into the footwall. And I'll leave it there as kind of a summary slide of my work at Sudbury. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. It was really
Any
nice,
questions?
very interesting talk. As I said earlier, if you have some questions, please type them in the chat and Sarah will answer them. I may have one quick question. In the at
Sure.
slide 10, I think it was 10, you show the mass balance and why it's exceeding 100%.
Exceeds. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So this mass balance, it's not 100%. Well, it's not. It's really the precision, because essentially you have errors in determining your tracer elements by laser. You have errors in determining your PGEs by whole rock analysis. That's pretty precise. It's really the laser, I would say. For elements, in particular chalcopyrite, yes, there are interferences, or I mentioned there are interferences on ruthenium, rhodium, and palladium that you need to take into account. That might give some error in accurately determining the trace elements in your sulfides. Another issue is that when the trace elements are so low in your whole rock and again so low in your sulfides that your error is probably much larger than 10%. So we normally say as an estimate that it's 100% plus or minus 15. So 100% could be 115 or it could be 85. Essentially, we can't be much more precise than that. So we take it, even though it's 118 here, it's a bit over. It's quite a bit over, but it's, I would say, within the precision. It's not super, super precise, just because there's so many variables that if everything is at high level and there are no interference, well, we use nickel blanks and copper blanks to try and negate the interferences, but it's still maybe not perfect. But when you have something, it's been a while since I've lasered sulfides now. Now I've moved into magnetite. So yes, I'm sure with the new laser, because the detection limits are better, the standards are better. So that's another thing to take into account. In the early days, there were no real sulfide reference materials with accurate PGEs, or well, it was only for PGEs, in fact, the chalcophile elements. They weren't very accessible. So now there are more sulfide reference materials available. They're probably better characterized, that everything now is probably a bit tighter.
I see Clifford has a question about gold.
Yes. Yeah. Which PGM does it go into? Gold, I never found, well, I see trace amounts when I lasered a tiny bit of gold, but it wasn't really a PGM. It was mainly electrum, so a mixture of gold and silver. And yes, they were, occasionally I saw them with the late stage PGMs, so in the copper rituals. Otherwise, I never really saw them at all.
Yeah.
So, because gold is not a PGM, you might have very trace amounts with, say, within a platinum mineral, but it typically forms its own mineral normally with silver. You don't actually get pure gold.
Rune has a question about low sulfide deposit with high PGM like Bushveld.
Yeah, missed it. Yeah, he said he came in late. I will try find the slide. Here we go. So here, I put up a mass balance typical for the PGE-rich deposits. In fact, well, the example I gave was Norilsk. This is globular ore sitting on top of the massive sulfides at Norilsk. But essentially, the pattern is the same for the Bushveld, for the Stillwater. A very good review, if you're interested, is Barnes et al. 2008, where she reviewed her team's work on various layered intrusions, including Belinda Godel's work on the Stillwater and Bushveld, to propose. That's really kind of the starting point as to try and understand where the PGE are in these sulfide in these PGE systems. So even though this is Norilsk, which is not a sulfide poor deposit at all, it is still PGE rich. That the PGE reefs, like the Bushveld, have essentially the same pattern. When you essentially there, I think it's because there isn't as many semi-metal elements, because you're far from contamination. Your source of sulfur is normally internal. You reach sulfide saturation internal of the magma. You don't need an external source. I think it's the low concentration of arsenic and semi-metals, and the time means that the PGM just aren't forming as much, apart from platinum. Platinum just never seems to want to stay in a sulfide. It will always just dissolve or crystallize out. But the other elements, if there are no semi-metals around, like arsenic, antimony, they're fairly happy to stay in the base metal sulfides. The question of what kind of fluids move palladium platinum. Yes, at Sudbury, a lot of work has been saying there are chlorine complexes that are doing this. It's difficult to see because you never see the chlorine actually with the PGE. They never crystallize together. However, if I'm just trying to remember, there's a lot of work by Jake Hanley on this, as well as Catherine Farrow. If I remember well, it's not necessarily the chlorine that's important. The chlorine is there, but I believe Jake Hanley's work showed you need a carbonate-rich fluid will actually move it. Otherwise, it needs to be very, very acidic, if I remember well. If that answers your question, Cliff.
Anyone? Any other question? Maybe.
I'd just like to say this was. Can I just finish off by saying this was kind of the start. This was, well, what, 8 years ago now. There's a lot of work since on nickel-copper PGE deposits from various type of deposits. The work with Sarah Jane Barnes is still going on with her current students, so there's a lot of work now out if you're interested to see some more recent stuff. I advise you to go,
Cliff asked
look.
if you have gold in footwalls.
No gold in the footwall. Because they call them high PGE, but often gold is kind of grouped within the PGE. Probably. I wasn't specifically looking at those. I was really on the massive sulfides to see what is maybe the magmatic origin of those. But I would say probably gold gets dispersed into the footwall. I don't know what phase it's in though, but there are some more recent studies that have specifically looked at that because they are very. There's quite a few deposits in of these low sulfide high PGE types at Sudbury, and so there's been a lot of recent work.
Okay. So I guess if there are no more questions, if everybody by watching again the video has more questions, they can send you an email.
Oh, for sure, yes.
If not,
I'd be more than happy
we're going to close it for today. So please, I will look forward for my follow-up email that will give you the link for the YouTube channel video. Next webinar will be in 1 month on the 2nd of November, and it will be given by Alti Fransen from Iceland Geosurvey on gold exploration in Iceland. And finally, on behalf of Sarah and myself, we are thank you for joining us and taking time to view this very, very nice presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending, and thanks for your nice comments afterwards as well. Take care.